In the world where companies try their hardest to make their systems as appealing as possible to consumers, Nintendo tends to be the primary suspect when it comes to making trade-offs that negatively affect consumers. This ranges from unnecessarily aggressive measures just for combating piracy to stifling developers' abilities to put their games on their systems, which later becomes an issue for consumers not getting the vast library of games that they could have. Nintendo has always been this way. So many of these decisions affect consumers, usually in a negative manner, and it's not until these decisions hurt Nintendo's pockets massively they even stop to consider the damage that they're causing. In this video, we will be talking about Nintendo's long history of anti-consumer practices that stretch all the way back when the Famicom or NES were the dominant force in the industry. This might shock you. Between 1983 and 1985, Americans experienced what is known as the Great Video Game Crash because there was so little in the way of quality control for games released on different platforms. Essentially, a lot of games were the equivalent of slop, consistently showing up on the market while not influencing it in a positive manner. The Famicom was doing pretty well in Japan since its launch in 1983, but it wasn't until 1985 that we got the Nintendo Entertainment System, its international equivalent. And credit where credit is due. Considering how lax most gaming platforms were when it came to putting games on their systems, Nintendo decided to host a closed ecosystem. This is considered to be pretty bad in a modern context. However, it's what allowed Nintendo to curate the games that they allow onto their system, which meant that not just any game could make it in. I believe that this contributed greatly to the NES being considered the best place to play the best games at the time. But simultaneously, Nintendo were the first ones to implement region locking on their systems to ensure that you could not play cartridges from other regions. This lock was actually applied on a hardware level with the 10 NES lockout chip that prevented cartridges from being played on systems of different regions. Not to mention that Nintendo games were also more expensive than the rest of the competition. Even back then, developers and publishers had to source cartridges directly from Nintendo, which drove prices up for Nintendo's games. According to some estimates, developers and publishers paid between $10 and $14 for every NES cartridge when they used to pay only between $3 to $5 for Atari cartridges and no licensing attached to them. As a result, many Atari 2600 games were priced between $25 and $35, and then Sega Master System games were priced at around $30 to $40, and NES cartridges could go as high as even $60. All in 1980s money. This would be the equivalent of roughly $150 in today's money. Developers also had to sign an exclusivity deal with Nintendo and were limited to only publishing around 5 games per year on their platform. Nintendo had a very tight grip on developers and publishers, hence on the industry at large. And many parties were affected by Nintendo's decision to charge so much for their cartridges, as costs were passed on to consumers, but this was even enough for none other than Atari to take them to court. Nintendo's dominance over the console gaming market caused issues with the FTC. Nintendo was accused of fixing the price floor cost of an NES game, effectively preventing it from being sold at below a certain amount, which usually meant very minimal discounts on games if they ever went on sale. They were also accused of applying pressure on retailers to only host Nintendo products by limiting access to important Nintendo hardware and software if they didn't comply. All of these things aren't just anti-consumer, but also just anti-competitive. Nintendo ultimately agreed to settle the case, but without any kind of intervention, we would still be dealing with the consequences of Nintendo's actions. And similar licensing requirements were relevant to Nintendo's Game Boy and their games. Publishers and developers also had to source their cartridges directly from Nintendo, which were also expensive at anywhere between $6 and $8. But the Game Boy wasn't victim to the region locking implemented on Nintendo's home console. These games were also on the higher end to buy, sitting anywhere between $35 and going all the way up to $50 at the highest, at the very least from estimates that I've been able to find. But if this didn't paint a clear enough picture of how Nintendo has treated developers and consumers in the past, then perhaps the rest of this video absolutely will. The SNES era of Nintendo was probably one of the most consumer-friendliest. This was one of Nintendo's most competitive eras, with the Sega Genesis fighting very hard against them. The 16-bit era is widely remembered for the back and forth that Nintendo and Sega had, as they tried expanding into 3D graphics, at least to the extent that the hardware would allow. Then Sega trying a lot of different things during this time, even adapting the CD tech and even 32-bit graphics with entirely new accessories for the Genesis. Nintendo actually kept things a lot simpler, building the chipsets that enable 3DS graphics on the game cartridges that required them. This absolutely made these cartridges more expensive to purchase for developers and publishers, and as a result, kept prices high for these cartridges regardless of it all. These cartridges were still region-locked as well, which of course made importing games and actually using them a lot more difficult, and meant that you were pretty much locked into paying local prices. But this time, there were games that were going for even close to $80, with Chrono Trigger being one of the most expensive games on the platform. At this time, I don't believe that Nintendo deserved too much scrutiny for not going with CDs for the SNES, and CDs were really not common at all in the gaming space. The cartridges were kind of expensive, though when compared to CDs, which were much cheaper and could hold a lot more data, a fact that became relevant just a few years later with the launch of the Nintendo 64. Nintendo's way of trying to stay ahead of the competition by adapting 64-bit graphics instead of 32-bit. But there were so many problems with how Nintendo handled many things around the system. Before the launch of this system, their competitor Sega had fully embraced the CD format for their games, which did make printing games much more affordable, and it allowed for a lot more storage space. Sony effectively did the same thing with the introduction of the PlayStation. So save data could not be written to these disks directly, but saves were instead held inside of memory cards or internal memory units in these consoles. The move to CDs was very important, but CDs are much easier to print pirated content to than cartridges, and Nintendo had no control over the distribution of CDs, so they just decided to nerf the potential of the N64 by putting their games once again onto cartridges. These cartridges held up to 64 megabytes of storage, while a single CD could hold up to around 700 megabytes. This was when many third parties had enough with them, since they wanted to do so much more with their games, but had to adhere to Nintendo's limitations to do so, and many projects probably wouldn't have been possible on the N64 because of this. I mean, Nintendo had 6 entire Final Fantasy games exclusively in their system. Very important JRPGs to have, and they let the insane success that was Final Fantasy VII go to the PlayStation instead, just because they didn't want to deal with pirates and to maintain control over the distribution of their media. This is one instance where Nintendo was actually punished for being anti-third party, and by extension, anti-consumer. The Nintendo 64 is also region-locked, but not exactly at the hardware level that we're used to dealing with. Instead of using chips specifically for region locking, Nintendo opted for a much more cost-efficient way of locking their system by just shaping their cartridges a little bit differently so that cartridges from any other region couldn't physically slot in. They're still persistent on keeping their system locked, but this is something that could easily be bypassed by just removing the part of the slot that kept these cartridges from fitting properly. The Nintendo 64 had incredible games, but these decisions kept it from soaring like it could have. This was the generation where Nintendo held a distant second place to Sony's PlayStation, not even holding a candle to what they achieved. Nintendo knew that huge changes had to be made, and that they really did mess up. The 2000s was a very interesting era for Nintendo. This decade, Nintendo had so many products out on the market and started off incredibly strong with the Game Boy Advance, essentially an SNES but in your pockets. The biggest issue with this system was the fact that it still didn't have a backlight, even if it did almost everything else correctly. Then Nintendo launched the Game Boy Advance SP, which gave us a clamshell design, and finally a backlight. This is the definitive way of playing GBA games for a lot of people. The GameCube was Nintendo's first console of this decade, and it had a lot of improvements over the N64. Nintendo opted for a much nicer controller and the ability to play games on disc, but this system came with more compromises than improvements. Nintendo was still very concerned about pirates. This meant that Nintendo introduced mini discs instead of normal CDs or even DVDs, which were proprietary, that had to be sourced directly from Nintendo. But at least these mini discs were a lot more affordable, closer in price to what a DVD disc would cost. These mini discs could hold a lot more data than a CD, but still only held a fraction of what a DVD could, which was widely used by Sony and Microsoft on their systems. GameCube was still region-locked, and many third parties were so weary of working with Nintendo, but they did get more third-party support this time around, even if it paled in comparison to the Xbox and PlayStation 2 and how much more those systems got. Another aspect that some people contest is the fact that Nintendo hardly paid any attention to the growing online console gaming scene, with them barely supporting it beyond just a handful of games, while the competition was pushing forward with this concept. All of these things limited the kinds of games that could be ported to the GameCube, so it unfortunately still lacked greatly, and Nintendo was once again punished with low hardware sales. It really felt like the industry was just leaving behind what was once a titan until the Wii launched. The Wii was a worldwide phenomenon and somehow made it while being just slightly more powerful than the GameCube and not adapting in almost any way to the many modern conveniences and improvements that the competition had on their systems. But they finally embraced DVDs in the sense, even though they were proprietary, which meant that you couldn't play any DVD movie on the Wii, just original Nintendo Wii and GameCube games. But this is the first home console from Nintendo to ever hold backwards compatibility with the previous generation, which was nice. Online play was free when available, but Nintendo's online infrastructure was still in its very early stages, which meant that it was far behind what the PlayStation Network and Xbox Live were capable of, and Nintendo never really did much to remedy this, making the Wii a mostly local multiplayer system except for those games that weren't super competitive. The Wii had its issues, and it became outdated pretty quickly, but Nintendo kept a consistent stream of games coming. The Wii performed incredibly well sales-wise, but the DS absolutely trumps the Wii's numbers. The DS was such an incredible concept that came at exactly the perfect time. It was region-free, had a rechargeable battery, had a lot of fun games, pretty interesting technology for a portable gaming device, and it was affordable. The DS's cartridges were also pretty cheap with all things considered, which kept DS game prices pretty low. The highest price I ever saw for a brand new DS game was $40, as long as it was just a standard edition game. The DS Lite was also a huge hit, one that was affordable and offered so many improvements, but the DSi line of products definitely had some strange quirks to them that affected consumers negatively. The DSi does not have a Game Boy Advance cartridge slot, which meant that the GBA library was getting phased out very quickly, with Nintendo trying to push more towards digital distribution. That also meant that this improved model has removed functionality, with some of Nintendo's biggest games, such as the Pokemon games, that used that slot for Pokemon migrations between generations, and even other DS games became almost unplayable, such as Guitar Hero. The DSi XL was just a larger, more expensive version of the normal DSi that unfortunately just felt like kind of a slap on the face to the consumer. So if you purchased any games digitally on the DSi, then you simply would not have any kind of access on the DSi XL, and vice versa, which meant that if you were interested in upgrading and had any digital games, then you were just out of luck essentially. This was quite the oversight, and entirely an issue created by the fact that Nintendo neglected to include a unified account system. The DSi line of products were also region locked, which unfortunately is something that Nintendo tends to implement every time that they're winning the console race. Nintendo had a decent first half of the decade, but an amazing second half as they became the top dog in the gaming industry, sales-wise. Nintendo knew this, and they absolutely let it get to their heads. This era of Nintendo started with the 3DS, which was a very controversial handheld. Nintendo announced a very powerful upgrade to the DS that is fully backwards compatible with DS games that don't use the GBA slot in any meaningful way, and a really interesting gimmick that capitalized off of the popularity of 3D technology. But there were two factors that severely hurt its performance for some time. Nintendo was comfortable charging an entire $250 for this system, one that was set to be considerably weaker than the upcoming PS Vita, priced very similarly. This created a price barrier that a lot of people were willing to avoid climbing altogether. Cartridges were more expensive this generation, but a lot of games retained similar prices, so the cartridge costs were not really what held the system back. By the way, the 3DS remained region locked. The lack of sales and acclaim was so low that they ended up lowering the cost of the system, offering a bunch of games for free to ambassadors, and they poured a ton of support for it over the years. The Wii U was not so lucky. After the huge success of the original Wii, Nintendo launched a purposefully underclocked system that was just a bit more powerful than the Xbox 360. right at the turn of the generation, where their successors would be much more powerful than that. This was one reason why it was so troublesome to develop for this system, and this mostly happened because Nintendo wanted it to be quiet, meaning that the Wii U was technically more capable but was throttled by Nintendo themselves. The marketing was poor, but not anti-consumer. Although that did affect the early impressions of the Wii U significantly. They went from having a ton of third-party support to having considerably less than they had originally announced. The Wii U was discontinued nearly 5 years after it first launched, but its successor, the Nintendo Switch, was and continues to be widely successful. But this system did have its fair share of anti-consumer behaviors attached to it. Multiple games were sold on Nintendo's platform, but a select few were only up for sale for a limited amount of time. Super Mario 3D All-Stars was one of those games, and it stung because those sold out, which meant that you have to pay scalpers if you want to own this game at all. This was also the generation where Nintendo started doing code in the box, which was just a physical case with a download code for games, instead of using a physical cartridge. This was a very silly idea that unfortunately some publishers tried to milk for as long as they could. And it's important to note that everyone loved the idea of a virtual console on the Switch, like how it existed on the Wii U and 3DS. You buy a retro game, you download it, and there are no recurring payments attached to your purchase. But Nintendo decided to tie the virtual console to their now paid Switch Online subscription service, which meant that you don't own these games, it can be challenging to play them offline, and you have to keep paying for them to access them. You have no control over what you pay for either, as games are added and removed whenever they decide to do so. Not to mention that you weren't paying for a stable service either. Nintendo Switch Online was notoriously bad at launch, and for the coming months, even years, until it became what it is today, which is still inferior to what Xbox and PlayStation have cooked up by now. But worse than all of this is the fact that Nintendo decided that they should be able to brick your console if you do things with it that they don't agree with. This is hardware that you purchased, and they still want control over it. If you hack your console, you don't just risk a ban, but you risk having your console bricked, and the actions that could trigger this become a bit vague. If you purchase a used game and insert it into your system without realizing that it could have been ripped, then you risk getting banned, or even worse, having your console rendered completely useless by remote means. I've heard a lot of rumors surrounding bricking and banning your console over purchasing a used game that had been ripped to a modded system, but I haven't been able to confirm whether this has actually happened and to what extent. It seems theoretical, but their EULA basically implies that they can. Over the course of the Switch's life cycle, Nintendo has also done its best to shut down fan projects or even smash tournaments that don't comply with exactly how Nintendo wants them to play games that they no longer sell or support in any way. This has been very demoralizing to those who just want to keep the game alive through tournaments and live events, which is a huge shame considering that Melee is a fan-favorite Smash Bros. Game. Nintendo has consistently done this to many fan projects, which is very much unfortunate. Everyone just wants to support them as much as possible and to show how much they love their games, and Nintendo just won't let them. Nintendo went ahead and followed their typical up-down track record of releasing a highly beloved console, then one that was more controversial. It happened from the SNES to the N64, only got worse with the GameCube, then greatly improved with the Wii, where the Wii U performed terribly, then back to their biggest home console winner, the Switch. This is the case because the Switch 2 is a highly controversial system, yet again. Nintendo has a history of making their own cartridges and making publishers source them directly from Nintendo, usually costing more than the competition. This time, it's not much different, except for the fact that they included two types of cartridges, very limited options by the way, a 64GB cartridge and a cartridge that will enable you to download the game directly on your system, also known as a game key card. This is quite literally a physical key that lets you download from the internet and access a game containing very little data at all on that piece of plastic. These cards, likely being much cheaper than the 64GB cartridge, was too good to resist for publishers. A lot of consumers absolutely hate it because it still defeats the purpose of owning a game physically. This cartridge isn't a key that lets you install the game from the cartridge itself, so it is not local, but it downloads it from the internet, meaning that these cards will be completely useless once they stop enabling downloads from their servers. Now, for some time, consumers got used to paying $60 at most for a single game, until $70 became the new norm. But shortly after we accepted that $70 was the base, Nintendo took things a step further. Nintendo were the first ones to introduce a game with a base price of $80. that being Mario Kart World. This doesn't include any DLC or even any promise of free DLC. It is just the base game, one that has had content removed from it post-launch. No matter how upset this made customers, Nintendo has insisted on selling more games at $80, including Kirby and The Forgotten Land, which is a Switch 1 game that's been ported to the Switch 2. This is also when Nintendo got much more serious and frankly scary about potential modifications made to your system. In their updated EULA, it states that they may render your console completely unusable if you fail to comply with Nintendo's rules around modifications, which can include any software exploits, hardware modifications, tampering of any kind, etc. It's true that you paid for your Switch 2 in full, however, you better use it the way that they want you to, otherwise it's just a paperweight. I don't believe that Nintendo has ever actually enacted any brickings of systems, but according to the EULA, they reserve the right to do so. Also, the September Direct just took place for the Nintendo Switch 2, and it revealed even more scummy practices from Nintendo, particularly when it comes to how they handle DLC. Donkey Kong Bonanza released all the way back in June, about 3 months ago, and Nintendo already announced $20 DLC with extra content, effectively making it a $90 purchase for gameplay that probably just got cut from the original release considering how recent this game is. But even worse, much more egregious, is how they handled Pokemon Legends EA. This is a $70 game on the Switch 2, and they announced a $30 DLC pack with extra content and Pokemon a month before the game itself even launches, effectively making this a $100 price at launch. This isn't content that the developers cooked up to continue supporting the game sometime after it launched, but it is DLC that will be ready at launch. The money grubbing doesn't even end there, with Nintendo now selling amiibos officially for up to $50 for certain models. This isn't being done by scalpers. This is being done by Nintendo. The Mario Galaxy amiibo itself costs as much as what they're selling the game itself for on the Switch 2, which by the way is its own other can of worms considering that these are very old Mario games. They are showing no signs of holding back when it comes to pricing, and frankly, they do not care that so many people dislike these practices, because there will always be people who buy these things at prices that should be unacceptable, at high enough numbers that it drowns out the voices of the very many that do genuinely have a problem with being taken advantage of. All of this is absolutely terrible, and unfortunately, they only get more aggressive with these things every single generation. Now, hopefully this video gave you some insight on Nintendo's long history of anti-consumer behavior, as it has been going on for as long as they've been making consoles and fully fledged gaming handhelds. These problems get more aggressive and more egregious with every generation, but some actions are being taken to address them. Nintendo is currently being sued by a Brazilian agency that claims that Nintendo is violating Brazilian consumer protection laws with their EULA. Game key cards on the Switch 2 are not selling well at all, which is hurting third-party sales, and I believe that this and the consumer uproar are the reasons why Nintendo launched a survey to ask people about how they feel regarding game keycards, but they shut it down pretty shortly after, so who knows. Nintendo might fix some of these issues in the future, but they've only made amends with their consumers when their consoles start to fail, so we will see what happens in the future. But most signs point to them continuing their track record of anti-consumer behavior. Now, this was an interesting topic to explore, but there's so much to talk about regarding how things have changed in the industry. At some point, I'd like to make a video on the history of video game prices, so subscribe so that you don't miss that mini documentary when it comes out. Thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and do consider pressing the hype button on this video to boost it in the algorithm, and sharing it also helps out a ton. Until next time.